They wore crowns, but none escaped the grave. Some died in glory, others choked on lampreys, fell off horses, or vanished into stone towers. This is not a royal biography. It's a death march through the throne room where every coronation is just the beginning of a countdown. From battlefield beheadings to bathroom strokes, witness how every English and British monarch met their end. Because behind every divine right is a final breath. Before we dive into the blood-soaked, gout-ridden, arrow-pierced royal history of England and beyond, hit that subscribe button to join the weirdest corner of historical storytelling on YouTube. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what ungodly hour is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? We won't judge. This is, after all, the perfect bedtime story, if your dreams can handle it. Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great was not supposed to be king. He was the fifth son, basically a medieval afterthought with a knack for reading Latin when everyone else was just trying not to get stabbed. But after a few convenient deaths in the family, Alfred found himself wearing the crown in a country half-eaten by Vikings. He spent most of his reign bouncing between guerrilla warfare and rebuilding the wreckage into something resembling a nation. People called him the Great because he didn't lose everything. But greatness is funny when it dies ugly. In the end, Alfred's body betrayed him in slow, miserable silence. He suffered from a mysterious and excruciating stomach illness that turned his insides into something resembling a medieval curse. Some suspect Crohn's disease. Others think it was divine punishment for giving sermons while his people starved. Either way, the man who beat the Danes couldn't beat his own guts. He died in 899, doubled over in pain, leaving behind a brittle kingdom held together with prayer and paranoia. His body was lost, literally, dug up, misplaced, reburied, and maybe dumped in a pit. Because in England, even the greats get thrown into holes and forgotten. Speaking of forgetting, Edward the Elder. Edward the Elder inherited the problem Alfred couldn't fix, an England that didn't really exist yet. He ruled a country more imagined than real, half made of feuding warlords, the other half of bad weather and worse Latin. Edward was a builder, though. He built forts, built roads, built alliances with people who would later betray his grandchildren. They called him Elder because apparently no one had the charisma to call him Great twice. His end was anticlimactic in the saddest way. He died of natural causes, probably after falling ill during a campaign to suppress a rebellion, a nice euphemism for chasing Welsh and Mercian warlords through the mud until his body gave out. One minute he's leading men into the heart of a civil war, the next he's slumped over on a wet horse, somewhere in the countryside, with a belly full of regrets and possibly an arrow wound no one talks about. There were no glorious speeches, no dramatic battle. Just one more king who died trying to fix a kingdom that hadn't decided if it wanted to exist. But his son, Athelstan? He wouldn't die quietly. He'd die, predictably. Athelstan. Athelstan was the king who finally completed England, or at least that's what the monks scribbled in the margins between doodles of dragons. He beat the Scots, slapped the Danes, and managed to keep his half-brothers from murdering each other long enough to pass on the crown. Historians like to imagine him as a pious warrior, king, someone who quoted scripture while disemboweling invaders. In reality, he was probably more exhausted than holy. He died of natural causes in 939, which is medieval shorthand for his heart gave out from sheer stress. No poison, no betrayal, no arrow to the face. Just slow decay in a bed, probably crawling with lice. His court mourned, but not too loudly. There were succession crises to arrange and power vacuums to exploit. Athelstan had no children, only nephews who would soon turn England back into a collection of angry maps. His death marked the end of the illusion that England was stable, because the next man to wear the crown, he wouldn't die in bed. He'd die at a feast, and not the good kind. Edmund I. Edmund I was 24, newly crowned, and already drenched in blood. They called him Edmund the Magnificent mostly because calling him Edmund the Pretty okay didn't have much staying power in monastic propaganda. He spent his short reign wresting control back from Norse invaders and internal traitors, which in those days was just called being king. He was fierce, fast, and, unfortunately, too trusting at dinner. In 946, during what should have been a routine feast, Edmund spotted a known outlaw in the crowd. No guards, no weapons check, just a man who had once been exiled. Sitting in the banquet hall, probably chewing something smug, Edmund, in a move that sounds brave until you remember he was king, decided to personally remove the man from the hall. He never got the chance. In the ensuing scuffle, the outlaw stabbed him right there, in front of the nobility, the wine, and God. The great king died on the floor, blood pooling beneath roasted meat and half-filled goblets. A crown lost to a petty knife in a crowded room. Not exactly a battlefield, not exactly heroic, but very, very English. And yet, the next king would die slower and stranger, as if his body just decided to give up. Eadred. Eadred was sick. Not battlefield sick or drink yourself to death sick. No, Eadred's illness was stranger. A slow, creeping, undignified decay of the stomach and throat. Chronic pain, difficulty swallowing, a condition that might have been Crohn's disease or cancer or something older, darker and unnamed. The kind of illness that medieval scribes didn't know how to write about without invoking demons. Despite this, Eadred held the throne for 9 years. 9 long years of groaning intestines and court politics. He ruled through proxies, barked orders between grimaces, and somehow still managed to beat the last Viking puppet king in the north. He starved Eric Bloodaxe out of York and brought the kingdom under one crown for a few minutes, anyway. But victory didn't fix his insides. His health worsened. He could barely eat. Some said he couldn't even chew bread by the end. When he died in 955, it was quiet. Less of a death and more of a slow resignation. No heirs. No real triumph. Just another English monarch consumed from within, as if the land itself had decided to gnaw him apart from the stomach up. Then came a king who didn't live long enough to rot, a boy king, a teenage ruler, and a corpse no one could explain. Eadwig. Eadwig became king at 15, which is roughly the same age most boys can't be trusted to keep a plant alive. Naturally, the kingdom fell into chaos. Eadwig's reign was short, scandalous, and wrapped in legend. Monks hated him. Nobles distrusted him. He skipped his coronation banquet to go lie in bed with his mistress and her mother, yes, both of them which might be the most medieval rock star thing ever committed to vellum. The church retaliated with sermons and scribes, painting him as morally corrupt and politically incompetent, but that doesn't explain how he died. In 959, at the age of around 18, Eadwig dropped dead. No wounds, no fever, no dramatic fall from a horse, just gone. The chroniclers don't say much, and what little they do say contradicts itself. Some whispered poison, others suggested heartbreak. Most just shrugged and started writing about his younger brother Edgar, who didn't skip banquets for bedmates. What remains is a gap, a blank space in the record surrounded by spite and speculation, A boy too young to die of natural causes, too controversial to be mourned, too forgotten to be remembered properly. But Edgar the Peaceful, he would live longer, rule wiser, die clean. Or so the scribes claimed. Edgar the Peaceful. Edgar the Peaceful ruled in the strange, quiet lull between disasters. No major wars, no royal assassinations, no Danish invasions. Just an unusually tranquil stretch of administrative reforms, monastic revivals, and crown polishing. They called him Peaceful because he didn't murder half his family to get the throne a rarity in those days. Instead, he waited for his teenage brother Eadwig to mysteriously die, then took over like a calm shadow sliding into place. His reign was, by all accounts, competent. He standardized coinage, reinforced the navy, courted the church, even made a public spectacle of being rowed on the River Dee by 8 subservient kings, which sounds impressive until you realize they were probably just exhausted local rulers forced into ceremonial paddling. And then, at 33, Edgar died. Of natural causes, which, for a medieval king, was basically winning the lottery. No poison, no feasting disasters, just expiration, like a candle, quietly burning out on a prayer-soaked desk. Some say he went too soon. Others argue he went exactly when he was supposed to, before the whole peaceful charade could fall apart. Because the crown he left behind, it went to his teenage son. And the next king would earn a name that stuck like blood. 7 monarchs down, and we've already had feasts turned fatal, thrones claimed in blood, and kings dropping dead mid-toilet break. If you're still here, you're exactly the kind of person we like. So go ahead, subscribe to the channel for more beautifully bleak bedtime history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Because, let's be honest, this probably isn't your healthiest late-night choice. But it might be your favorite. Edward the Martyr. Edward never got to rule in peace. He barely got to rule at all. Crowned at 13, he was a teenage king in a nest of snakes, surrounded by factions who hated each other more than they loved their country. His stepmother Ethelred wanted her own son, Ethelred, on the throne. The church backed Edward. The nobles did whatever kept them rich and unstabbed. For 3 years, England teetered under the weight of a child monarch whose only mistake was existing in the wrong womb. In 978, Edward visited Corfe Castle. There, his stepmother greeted him with what might have been wine and a knife. He was stabbed, possibly, while still on horseback and left to bleed out in the dirt. Some say it was a servant. Others say Elfrith herself gave the order. Officially, he was buried without honor. Unofficially, his corpse was reburied twice to avoid divine retribution. The church later canonized him, not for ruling wisely, not for leading armies, but for dying poorly and inconveniently. Thus he became the Martyr, because sometimes sainthood is just PR for regicide. His half-brother would wear the crown next, and he'd wear it badly. History would name him not for what he did, but for what he didn't. Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred was not unready in the sense of being unprepared. No, the original term was unrad, meaning bad counsel. So really, he was Ethelred the badly advised, king surrounded by idiots, sycophants, and traitors who handed him a flaming country and a bucket of oil. His reign was a study in panic. The Danes returned, the nobles argued, ransom money drained the treasury. Every solution created 3 more disasters. He came to the throne after his stepbrother Edward's murder, likely orchestrated by Aethelred's own mother. Not exactly a confidence-building origin story. The boy king inherited blood and suspicion and grew into a man who paid the Danes to leave, only to watch them come back richer and angrier. By the end, even the church had stopped pretending. In 1016, Ethelred died of illness, possibly a stroke. Some said it was the weight of guilt, others blamed divine punishment. More likely, it was just the accumulated rot of a reign gone rancid. His death wasn't mourned so much as tolerated. England didn't grieve, it braced itself. Because his son, Edmund Ironside, wasn't dying of shame or illness. He was dying on the toilet. Or maybe being murdered on it. Either way, it got weird. Edmund Ironside. Edmund Ironside earned his nickname the old-fashioned way, by refusing to die in battle. He fought 6 major clashes against Danish invaders in 1 year. That's practically a cardio routine in Anglo-Saxon terms. Where his father Ethelred stalled and stumbled, Edmund charged forward grimy, furious, and blood-soaked. A king forged in chaos, crowned mid-invasion, ruling a country in pieces while its nobles whispered, "Maybe we should just give it to the Danes?" He didn't. Not yet. For a while, it seemed like Ironside might pull it off, might keep the kingdom stitched together with sheer willpower and sword wounds. Then, like all improbable heroes, he abruptly died. The year was 1016. The location? Probably London. The cause? Well, that's where it gets suspicious. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, it was poison. Or a knife. Or according to one unusually colorful account, a stabbing while on the toilet. Nothing like royal assassination and bathroom humor sharing a punchline. However he died, it was badly timed. His treaty with Canute split England in 2, and his death handed it all to the Danes. Ironside's body might have been made of steel, but his luck? Paper thin. And Canute the Viking who followed didn't die fighting. He died, somewhat bored. Canute the Great. Canute the Great was not English, not particularly charming, and definitely not subtle. But he was clever, a Viking king who managed to make the English nobility feel like it was their idea to hand him the crown. Once in power, he ruled like a man who wanted to prove a point, and that point was, "I can do this better than you." He united England, Denmark, Norway, and part of Sweden. Technically, that made him the ruler of more Englishmen than most English kings. His public image was tightly managed. You might have heard the famous story. Canute orders the tide to halt, to show his followers that not even a king can command nature. Humble, right? Except Canute also taxed the coastline, so the moral lesson gets a little blurry. He died in 1035 of natural causes, possibly from a lance wound to the side, according to one medieval chronicler who may or may not have been hallucinating. More likely, it was an illness, or just fatigue. The empire he built didn't last. Empires rarely do, but for a moment, the Viking wore the English crown without having to steal it. His son Harold would not be so lucky. In fact, Harold would barely make it to the throne at all. Harold? I Harefoot? Harold I, known charmingly as Harefoot, earned the nickname for his speed. Not his intellect, not his charisma, just his ability to move quickly, which, in a kingdom where murder happened at dinner, was a survival skill. He seized the throne in 1035, not because he was the rightful heir he wasn't, but because his half-brother Harthacnut was stuck in Denmark playing Game of Thrones with ice and axes. Harold ruled in his absence, and then just kept ruling. Like a guy who was asked to house-sit and then burned the place down but insisted he still owned it. His reign was marked by political suppression, exile, and at least one case of probable corpse desecration. He allegedly had his half-brother's ally dug up and tossed into a swamp, because medieval politics was nothing if not subtle. And then, one day in 1040, Harold dropped dead. No warning, no drama. Just sudden natural causes. Some say illness, some say divine punishment. Others say his heart simply gave out after too many bad decisions in a row. The country barely had time to react before the next king arrived. And Harthacnut? He didn't die quietly either. He died laughing, literally, at a wedding. Harthacnut. Harthacnut was the king who took his time. He delayed coming to England so long after his half-brother Harold Harefoot usurped the throne that by the time he finally arrived, his welcome party had already packed up and fled. He wasn't just late, he was fashionably, unreasonably, almost theatrically late. And when he did take the crown in 1040, it wasn't with cheers but with a tax hike so brutal it practically caused a nationwide ulcer. He was paranoid, vengeful, and oddly flamboyant for a man who wore chainmail. The kind of ruler who dug up his rival's corpse just to throw it into a marsh and then taxed the nation to pay for a funeral no one wanted. His reign lasted barely 2 years, but it was packed with intrigue, distrust, and enough sudden decisions to give his advisors whiplash. Then came the wedding, a light-hearted moment in an otherwise miserable reign. While celebrating, Harthacnut lifted his cup, laughed at a joke or maybe at the irony of his own reign and collapsed. Dead before he hit the floor. Possibly a stroke, possibly a seizure. Definitely humiliating. No heirs, no real legacy. Just a punchline in a royal disaster saga, which is exactly what the next king inherited along with the crown. Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor was a king made for legend. Holy, quiet, mysterious. The kind of monarch who probably stared at walls and made everyone else feel inadequate. His piety was so intense that later generations turned him into a saint, conveniently ignoring the political disasters that sprouted like weeds around his silence. He wasn't exactly decisive, but he was devout, which in medieval England was often the same thing. Edward came to the throne in 1042, after decades in exile. He ruled for over 2 decades longer than most kings managed to stay alive, yet somehow managed to leave the kingdom completely unprepared for what came next. His foreign advisors caused resentment. His failure to name a clear heir caused chaos, and his general indifference to ruling anything besides his own conscience allowed power-hungry nobles to sharpen their knives in plain sight. By the time Edward died in 1066, his body had given out from a series of strokes. Some say the stress killed him, others blame divine will. But it's hard not to notice that his death set off one of the most violent succession crises in British history. Because the man who came next, he didn't die of illness. He died of arrow-sand, maybe pride. Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson wasn't born to be king, he clawed his way there. Son of a powerful noble, brother-in-law to the previous king, and the kind of man who made enemies the way most people make acquaintances. His rise to power was fast, controversial, and sealed by a deathbed whisper. Edward the Confessor allegedly named him heir with his final breath. Convenient? Very. Legal? Debatable. Harold's reign lasted 9 months. That's it. Just enough time to repel one invasion from the north, gather a sleep-deprived army, and march south again into the arms of William of Normandy. They met at Hastings in 1066, one of those battles that textbooks love and soldiers dread. Harold held the line for most of the day, until the arrows came. One supposedly hit him in the eye, though accounts vary. Some say he was hacked to death by Norman swords. Some say both. What's certain is that he died in the mud under a banner that read, "Fighting for England." And like that, the Anglo-Saxon line ended. The last truly English king went down not in his bed or at a feast, but on the blood-soaked grass of a battlefield. The man who replaced him didn't die fighting. He died bloated and on fire. William I, the Conqueror. William the Conqueror spent his whole life proving people wrong. Bastard son of a duke? Fine, conquer Normandy. Not royal enough for England? Invade it. Have a terrifying temper, a murderous streak, and an expanding waistline? Make it fashion. He ruled with iron and paranoia, brutally reshaping England with castles, tax records, and a scorched earth policy that even hell would have found a little dramatic. He didn't die gloriously in battle. He died stupidly in the most unromantic, undignified way a warlord could go. In 1087, while riding through the burning town of Mantes, his horse reared. William lurched forward and slammed against the pommel of his saddle. Internal injuries, possibly ruptured organs, definitely ruined pride. He lingered in agony for weeks, and when he finally died, bloated and immobile, his body was left to rot. Literally. The funeral was a mess. His corpse didn't fit in the tomb. When they tried to force it, it burst. A sickening pop, a cloud of royal gas, and a wave of horror so bad that monks reportedly ran from the scene. So passed the first Norman king-conqueror of kingdoms, undone by his own girth. But his son, William Rufus, he died faster, stranger, with an arrow. William II, Rufus. William Rufus wasn't loved. He wasn't even liked. Red-faced, foul-mouthed, and aggressively secular, he was the medieval equivalent of a frat boy who stumbled into power and refused to leave. The church hated him. Nobles tolerated him. His own chroniclers couldn't decide if he was just terrible or the Antichrist. He liked money, war, and keeping his older priests very, very uncomfortable. Then came the New Forest, a hunting trip. August 1100. Rufus rides out with his men, among them Walter Tyrrell, a noble with good aim and suspicious timing. Somewhere between tracking deer and drinking wine, an arrow flies. Rufus falls, pierced through the chest. Accident? Maybe. Tyrrell fled immediately, which does not scream honest mistake. Conspiracy? Conveniently plausible? No investigation, no justice. Just a dead king left in the woods, his body carted back in a farmer's Carthus blood soaking through to the wheels. No wife, no heir, just a throne left warm and a brother, Henry, who didn't wait long before grabbing it. And Henry I? He wouldn't die by arrow or injury. No, Henry would die doing something even more English, eating too much of the wrong thing. Henry I was clever, cold, bureaucratically terrifying. The youngest son of William the Conqueror, he wasn't supposed to rule, but when both his brothers either died in hunting accidents or failed to hold on to Normandy, Henry moved in like a tax auditor with a sword. He centralized power, crushed rebellions, and created the Exchequer, England's first formal accounting system, because apparently nothing ruins dreams like a well-organized budget. But for all his intelligence, Henry had one weakness: lampreys. Slippery, eel-like fish considered a delicacy in medieval times. He loved them, obsessed over them, ate them to excess, against the advice of his own doctors, priests, and probably common sense. In 1135, while in Normandy, he consumed a particularly rich helping, a surfeit of lampreys, as the record states. Within hours, he was violently ill, vomiting, fever, pain, and then death. The king who built bureaucratic England died from gourmet gluttony, struck down not by rebellion or blade, but by a sea creature that looks like a medieval horror story. His body had to be boiled in wine before transport to England. Apparently, even in death, he was too high maintenance to rot in peace. Next on the throne, civil war, usurpation, and a king who died of, well, something very awkward. Stephen. Stephen of Blois was a king by accident and a survivor by stubbornness. He wasn't the heir. He wasn't even next in line. But when Henry I died and his daughter Matilda looked poised to take the throne, Stephen sprinted across the channel, charmed the nobility, and took the crown like a man grabbing the last seat in a burning theater. Thus began nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchia. Name that undersells just how miserable, lawless, and famine-stricken England became under his rule. Stephen fought. A lot. Sometimes he won. Often he didn't. He was captured, released, double-crossed, and occasionally forgot he was king at all. His reign was less a monarchy and more a very slow, nervous breakdown staged on a national level. He outlived Matilda's ambitions but eventually had to accept her son, Henry Plantagenet, as his heir. A diplomatic surrender by medieval standards. He died in 1154 of a sudden illness. Some say it was hemorrhoids. Others just call it a painful malady and move on quickly, as if the scribes themselves were too embarrassed to elaborate. After 2 decades of war, his body simply gave out quietly, without drama. But his successor, Henry II, wouldn't die quietly. He'd die betrayed, inflamed, and broken. Henry II. Henry II was the kind of man who made enemies faster than sons, and he had a lot of both. The first Plantagenet king, he ruled an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. He built a legal system, crushed barons, and argued theology with an intensity that could burn wallpaper. But his greatest act of self-sabotage came in the form of one line. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" He meant Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, former friend, now infuriating thorn. Whether Henry meant to order his assassination or just wanted to blow off steam remains unclear. What is clear, 4 knights took the line as gospel, stormed into the cathedral, and butchered Becket at the altar. The fallout was biblical: public penance, political exile, a kingdom teetering, and 4 sons who grew up learning betrayal as a first language. By the end, Henry was warring against his own children, one of whom, Richard the Lionheart, would spend more time defying him than learning from him. In 1189, Henry died of a fever, likely from dysentery, in Anjou, alone, defeated, betrayed. The list of those who abandoned him included everyone from his wife to his favorite son. That son would be king next, and would die, fittingly, from a crossbow bolt to the gut. Richard I, the Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart was a king who treated England like an ATM. He barely spent time there, maybe 6 months total, but the legends made up for it. Crusader, warrior, chivalric icon. Also, absent landlord, tax-bleeding tyrant, and occasional war criminal. Depending on the source, he was either God's champion or a glorified raider with good PR. He fought in the Third Crusade, failed to take Jerusalem, insulted the French, and got captured on the way home held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor. England paid through the nose to get him back. Meanwhile, Richard continued fighting. Always fighting. Not for peace or governance, but for reputation, for castles, and occasionally for fun. His end came not on the battlefield, but during a minor siege in 1199 at the castle of Chalus. While inspecting the walls without armor because apparently invincibility was part of his brawn, he was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound festered, infection spread. He died days later, agonizingly, from a minor injury made fatal by pride and poor hygiene. The legendary crusader, undone not by armies, but by a peasant with good aim. His brother John would take the throne next, and history would have a lot to say. That's 22 monarchs buried, some with honor, others with a whisper, a scandal, or a red-hot poker. If you've made it this far, you clearly belong here. So, take a second, subscribe to the channel, and stay in the crypt with us. And while you're at it, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Because if it's past midnight and you're still listening to royal autopsies, you're officially one of us. John. King John is the reason so many British monarchs avoid that name like it's cursed, and maybe it is. He was greedy, paranoid, vengeful, and insecure. Imagine a toddler with a crown and a grudge. He lost most of his family's French lands, bullied the barons, ticked off the Pope, and squeezed the English treasury until even the coins felt resentful. His nobles hated him so much they made him sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document he ignored almost immediately because compromise wasn't in his vocabulary. His reign spiraled into civil war. One of his last acts was to lose the royal treasure in the Wash, a coastal marsh where his baggage train was swallowed by mud and tide. Gold, jewels, sacred relics. Gone. It's the kind of legend so embarrassing it still makes historians wince. By 1216, John's body gave out. The official cause was dysentery, likely caught during his final campaign. Other accounts say he was weakened by gluttony, drink, and sheer stress. His death was slow, messy, and lonely fitting for a man whose favorite pastime was betrayal. But his son, Henry III, would try something novel, not dying a disaster, just fading gracefully, almost boringly. Henry III ruled for 56 years longer than anyone before him and longer than anyone would again until Queen Victoria. He was crowned as a child after his father John's messy exit and grew up more monk than monarch. Soft-spoken, devout, decorated chapels while rebellions brewed outside. He preferred art to war, relics to strategy, and forgiveness to efficiency. His architectural obsession gave us Westminster Abbey. His reign gave us debt, instability, and a noble class that lost patience fast. Henry didn't govern so much as hover. He was constantly at odds with his barons, and eventually they revolted by Simon de Montfort. His brother-in-law turned enemy. Civil war erupted. Henry was captured, then rescued by his son, the future Edward I. Somehow, after all that, he kept the crown, but never quite the respect. He died in 1272, probably of natural causes, old age, exhaustion, possibly a broken heart after watching the realm he clung to buckle under his own indecision. His death went mostly unremarked. No dramatic assassination, no royal scandal, just a slow, wheezing stop. But his son Edward, he would die chasing glory and dysentery. Edward I. Edward I was sharp, tall, and terrifying. Nicknamed Longshanks for his towering frame and Hammer of the Scots for reasons that still make bagpipes weep, Edward was everything his father wasn't. Ruthless, decisive, militarily brilliant. He reformed law, strengthened royal authority, and crushed anyone who stood in his way, especially if they wore a kilt or practiced Welsh. He expelled the Jews from England in 1290, a dark legacy often overlooked in favor of his shiny military record. But Edward wasn't interested in popularity. He wanted power, control, order, and, eventually, Scotland. In 1307, at nearly 70 years old, Edward marched north again, old, sick, stooped, but determined to crush the rebellion led by Robert the Bruce. Along the way, his body began to betray him. His strength faded, and somewhere near the Scottish border, he died struck down by dysentery, that recurring medieval curse. On his deathbed, he He supposedly ordered that his bones be carried into every Scottish battle so his fury could live on. They didn't. His son ignored the request. That son, Edward II, would lose everything his father built and die. In a way so brutal, it became legend and possibly myth, or both. Edward II. Edward II was everything his father feared he'd be. Soft where he should have been steel, sentimental where he needed strategy, and deeply, catastrophically in love with the wrong people. Most infamously, Piers Gavestona knight so flamboyant, arrogant, and clingy that even the nobles who tolerated murder drew the line at his influence. Edward made him Earl of Cornwall, showered him with gifts, and ignored every warning. The barons responded by executing Gaveston and daring the king to care. He did. But not enough to stop them. Then came the war with Scotland and Edward's humiliating defeat at Bannockburn. While his father had hammered the Scots, Edward handed them a hammer and asked for advice. Rebellion festered. His wife, Isabella of France, once called the she-wolf, turned on him. She and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invaded. The king fled, was captured, deposed, and then, in 1327, came his death. Was he suffocated, beaten, starved? The most infamous story claims he was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted in a place no crown should shinny tail so lurid it probably reflects more hatred than fact. Still, he died imprisoned, disgraced, and quietly erased. His son, Edward III, however, would die like a king again, but not before watching everything crumble first. Edward III. Edward III reigned for 50 years and spent half of them proving he wasn't his father. He reclaimed the crown's dignity, started the 100 Years' War, and claimed the French throne because, sure, why not add another war? He built a chivalric court, founded the Order of the Garter, and generally made the Middle Ages feel like a noble's fever dream. Under him, England thrived for a while. But Edward didn't know when to stop. As he aged, power slipped into the hands of his mistress, Alice Perrers, and greedy courtiers who siphoned influence like blood. The Black Death ravaged the country. The treasury bled. His son, the Black Prince, predeceased him, leaving a frail 10-year-old grandson future Richard the Thirst heir. Edward became a relic of his former self, confused, sick, and surrounded by people waiting for him to die. In 1377, after years of decline, he suffered a stroke and died. Not on a battlefield, not in court, but in a half-forgotten corner, his legacy already tarnished. He'd been a warrior king once, but death came like dust, quiet and unimpressed. And that child, Richard II, would become king next. A boy raised on lies, and one day left to starve in the dark. Richard II. Richard II was born into chaos and raised like a messiah. Grandson of Edward III, son of the Black Prince, crowned at 10, adored in poetry, worshipped by sycophants. He believed he was chosen by Godin, ruled like God should be grateful. He was vain, impulsive, and elegantly dangerous, more obsessed with image than governance. His court shimmered with art and velvet while the realm sank under taxes and revolt. He crushed the peasants' revolt at 14, famously promising peace, then executing everyone who got in his way. That was Richard, performative mercy, immediate vengeance. As he aged, paranoia bloomed. He purged nobles, exiled rivals, ruled by decree. Parliament hated him. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke took notes. In 1399, while Richard campaigned in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned. Not as a rebel, but a claimant. Nobles flipped. Support collapsed. Richard was deposed, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and slowly erased. They say he starved to death in 1400, or was murdered, or simply wasted away in solitary silence, dreaming of velvet and power. No body, no fanfare. Just cold stone and a slow fade into legend. The next king, Henry IV, and he wouldn't die peacefully either. His body turned against him slowly, painfully, and quite publicly. Henry IV. Henry IV came to power on a promise and a coup. He wasn't next in line, he was just next in ambition. After deposing his cousin Richard II, he claimed the crown with the elegant logic of might makes right and a few signatures dragged from terrified nobles. But the crown, as it turned out, didn't fit comfortably. Almost immediately, rebellions sprang up like weeds. The Percy family, once his allies, turned traitor. The Welsh rose under Owain Glyndwr, and divine legitimacy, that was a stretch, especially since no one could forget how he got the job. The stress wore him down, so did the guilt, and then came the disease. By the end of his reign, Henry was a walking affliction. His face was disfigured by what some called leprosy, more likely a brutal skin disease. Others claimed he suffered from epilepsy or suffered strokes. He was weak, sometimes unable to speak, often unable to move. His body decayed in public. He collapsed in Westminster Abbey and had to be carried out mid-service. In 1413, the suffering stopped. He died, likely of a stroke, in the Jerusalem chamber of the Abbey, coincidence that gave his propaganda team one final poetic flourish. His son, Henry V, would rule differently, briefly, brilliantly, and die messily in France. Henry V. V was war on horseback. He inherited a fragile crown and turned it into a weapon, marching through France like a medieval storm. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 made him a legend-outnumbered, mud-soaked, arrow-filled victory that lived longer than most of his soldiers. He styled himself as King of England and France, and for a brief moment it looked like the world might agree. But he wasn't built for peace, or rest, or longevity. Henry ruled only 9 years, but burned through them with the intensity of a man who knew he was on borrowed time. His health faltered. Years of campaigning had worn down his body. In 1422, during the siege of Meaux, he fell ill dysentery again, that old royal nemesis. The king who had never lost a battle lost control of his bowels. Fever took him. He died at 35. He left behind a kingdom, a war, and an infant son. His funeral was a spectacle, his reputation untouchable, but it didn't matter, because no one could rule from the grave. And his son Henry VI would grow up haunted by ghosts, surrounded by war, and destined to die in the dark corner of a tower. Henry VI. Henry VI was a king, born to silence, crowned as a baby, praised as a saint in diapers, and raised in the long shadow of a dead father. He was gentle, bookish, devout, and entirely unfit for a world that demanded steel instead of scripture. England wanted another warrior. It got a monk with a crown. His reign was consumed by the 100 Years' War and the wars of the Roseza century of national whiplash. He lost France, lost his mind. Literally. Periods of catatonia, delusion, and withdrawal. He'd stare at walls for days, unaware that he was king, father, or even human. During these episodes, nobles governed in his name and plotted. always plotted. He was deposed once by Edward IV, restored for a moment, and then locked away in the Tower of London. In 1471, after Edward reclaimed the throne again, Henry was murdered. The official record said he died of melancholy. But that's the polite version. More likely, he was stabbed to death, possibly while praying. No fanfare, no justice. Just a crownless king dying in a dungeon, forgotten by the country he barely ruled. And the man who replaced him? Edward IV. A king of appetite who died suddenly, suspiciously, and still dressed for court. Edward IV was the kind of king who looked like he belonged on a coin, tall, charismatic, and so confident it bordered on reckless, he seized the throne in a swirl of blood and silk, twice. First by force, then by sheer stubbornness. His reign was a seesaw of battlefield glory and courtly indulgence. He overthrew Henry VI, lost the crown, and snatched it right back again like a monarch playing tug-of-war with fate. He ruled through charm and fear, loved luxury, loved women more. Rumors swirled about secret marriages, illegitimate children, and private indulgences that would have made a monk blush into his robe. He didn't care. He liked winning, whether on the field or at dinner. But death came without warning. In 1483, at just 40, he fell ill suddenly and fatally. Some say pneumonia, others typhoid. Whispers of poisoning still linger, a fitting rumor for a man who kept too many secrets and too many enemies. He died after a short sickness, bloated and ghost-pale, the edges of his court already sharpening their ambitions before he even went cold. His eldest son, Edward V, never truly ruled, and he wouldn't die in court, in battle, or in exile. He'd die in a tower, disappearing silently into legend. Edward V. Edward V was 12 when he became king, and he would never reach 13. A child caught in the gears of dynastic ambition, his reign lasted just over 2 months too short for a coronation, but long enough for a political abduction. After his father, Edward IV, died, Edward V was taken into custody by his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. For protection, they said. For the boy's own good. But protection looked suspiciously like a locked tower, an absent crown, and guards who didn't answer questions. His younger brother joined him soon after. 2 royal children, last seen playing behind barred windows in the Tower of London. And then nothing. No funeral, no grave, no explanation. They vanished. The official story unraveled into whispers, smothered in their sleep, drowned, poisoned, buried beneath stone steps. All roads led back to Richard, who declared Edward and his siblings illegitimate and took the throne as Richard III. The princes became symbols, martyrs, ghosts, but not kings. And Richard? He would wear the crown stained with suspicion, and unlike the boys, his death would be public, violent, and unforgettable. He would be the last king to die in battle, and his bones would be lost for centuries. Richard III. Richard III ruled like a man constantly watching his back because he was. Crowned on the wreckage of his nephew's vanished bodies, he never escaped the suspicion. Hunched shoulders, cold stare. Rumors of deformity and black magic swirled around him like a cloud of medieval bad press. Shakespeare turned him into a villain. History turned him into a question mark. But Richard wasn't just shadow. He was steel, efficient, brutal. He reformed the courts, stabilized the economy, and buried his enemies as quietly as possible. Still, his throne was fragile. A Tudor claimant, Henry of Richmond, rose against him. The nobles hedged their bets, and Richard, for all his cleverness, refused to run. At Bosworth Field in 1485, he charged head first into the chaos. No retreat, no cowardice, just a final, furious attempt to kill Henry himself. He made it close. Close enough to taste the future. Instead, he was surrounded, unhorsed, hacked to death. His body was stripped, mutilated, and thrown into a shallow grave. Crown lost. Dynasty ended. He was the last English king to die in battle, the last Plantagenet, and for centuries he was buried under a parking lot. The Tudors rose next, and they brought death in a more modern shape. Bureaucracy, disease, and decay. Henry VII. Henry VII won the crown not by birthright, but by winning the final round of a generational blood feud. The Battle of Bosworth Field gave him Richard III's crown and arguably his ghosts. His claim was flimsy, but his strategy was airtight. Marry Elizabeth of York, blend the warring houses, and build a dynasty that no one could question without disappearing under suspicious circumstances. He ruled like an accountant with a knife. Frugal, meticulous, and constantly paranoid. He taxed with precision, imprisoned with restraint, and rarely smiled without purpose. The Wars of the Roses had taught him one thing: everyone is a potential threat. So he suffocated rebellion with paperwork and watched his own court like a man waiting for a knife in the back. By the end, he wasn't a hero or a tyrant, just a tired man who outlived most of his enemies. He died in 1509, likely of tuberculosis, wasting away, coughing blood, counting coins until his lungs gave out. He left behind a bloated treasury, a suspiciously quiet nobility, and a son with no concept of moderation. Because Henry VIII wasn't just bigger, he was hungrier for power, for wives, and eventually for survival itself. Henry VIII exploded onto the throne like a firework made of testosterone and divine right. Handsome, athletic, golden, haired England's golden boy, until the gold wore off and left nothing but ulcerous legs, political executions, and a religious schism that split the nation in two. He married 6 times, broke with Rome, and created the Church of England just so he could divorce more efficiently. He turned on advisors, friends, and wives with equal ease. Anne Boleyn was beheaded. Thomas More lost his head. Cromwell followed. It became a pattern. Proximity to Henry was fatal. But the king lumbered on, getting fatter, sicker, more paranoid with each passing year. By the end, he was immobile, monstrous, and rotting alive. A suppurating leg ulcer oozed through layers of cloth and pride. He was carried from room to room on a mechanical chair, barking orders through gritted teeth and rotting gums. His courtiers flattered him. No one dared mention the smell. He died in 1547, likely from a cocktail of obesity, gout, heart failure, and unchecked infection. But he died in bed, still king, still terrifying. His son, Edward VI, inherited the crown next, and he'd be dead before his 16th birthday. Edward VI. Edward VI was the boy king everyone wanted to mold. Sickly, brilliant, and crowned at 9, he was the Tudor dynasty's last great hope and its shortest-lived experiment. Raised on Protestant zeal and Renaissance humanism, Edward was England's theological reboot sharpened by reformers, hollowed by expectation. He abolished Catholic rituals, rewrote prayer books, and ruled through regents who did most of the heavy lifting while he coughed in the background. But his health was never good. Even as a child, he was thin, pale, and prone to fevers. By 15, the writing was on the wall. His coughing worsened, His weight dropped. His skin turned gray. Tuberculosis, or consumption, as they called it, devoured him piece by piece until his bones pressed through the skin like a prophecy. He died in 1553, quietly and slowly, watched over by anxious advisors scrambling to keep control. His final act was a desperate attempt to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from taking the throne. He named Lady Jane Grey his heir instead, but Edward had barely gone cold before the throne was ripped from her hands. Mary came next, and her reign would be defined by blood, fire, and an excruciating end from within. Mary, I ruled with a mission, to unburn what her father and brother had torched. The daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, she clawed her way onto the throne in 1553 after a failed Protestant coup, and immediately set to work undoing decades of reformation. Her tools were fire and fear. Over 280 Protestants burned at the stake under her rule, bishops, reformers, commoners' flames licking the sins off their souls while the public stared. They called her Bloody Mary, a nickname soaked in both propaganda and truth. But behind the flames was a woman unraveling. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was cold, strategic, and joyless. Her attempts at restoring Catholicism were political disasters wrapped in liturgy. Worst of all, her own body betrayed her dreams. She experienced 2 false pregnancies, her belly swelling with hope and illusion, only to shrink into despair. The child she prayed for never came. She died in 1558, aged 42, likely from uterine cancer or an ovarian cyst. Her final days were full of pain, vomiting, and the bitter taste of failure. She left no heir, no triumph, just smoke. And in her place came Elizabeth, the sister she once tried to keep off the throne, who would outlive them all. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I began her reign already marked for execution. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, branded a bastard, nearly executed under Mary, and rumored to be infertile, too clever, too Protestant, too everything. But when the smoke cleared in 1558, she emerged wearing the crown and a knowing smile. She would never marry, never share power, never produce an heir. Instead, she married England and ruled it for 44 years like a woman possessed. She was cautious when others rushed, charming when others shouted, ruthless when others begged. She had Catholics hanged, drawn, and quartered. She oversaw the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, her rival, her mirror. She survived invasion attempts, conspiracies, and the Spanish Armada. She walked the knife edge between icon and tyrant. But time wore her down. In her final years, she became frail, melancholic, ghost-like. Her teeth rotted, her hair thinned beneath her red wigs. She stood for hours rather than lie down, terrified that if she slept, she wouldn't wake. In 1603, she finally gave in perhaps to pneumonia, perhaps to depression, perhaps to exhaustion itself. She died childless, alone, the last Tudor. And waiting in the wings was a Scot, a new dynasty, and a king who died slurring his last insult at a chamber pot. James I arrived in England with a Scottish accent, a lisp, and a wardrobe 2 decades out of date. He believed in divine right, smoked like a chimney, and thought witches were a legitimate threat to national security. The first Stuart King of England, son of the ill-fated Mary, Queen of Scots, he united the crowns of England and Scotland, but couldn't quite unite the people. He survived the gunpowder plot, wrote books on tobacco and demonology, and ruled through favorites who were suspiciously young, suspiciously handsome, and suspiciously powerful. He saw himself as Solomon reborn-wise, regal, chosen, but his subjects mostly saw him as weird. In his later years, his body began to collapse in slow motion. Arthritis stiffened his limbs, kidney disease bloated him, his speech slurred, his skin turned blotchy and bruised. By 1625, he could barely move, barely breathe, barely think clearly. He died after a long, stuttering decline, probably from a stroke, worsened by his endless medical treatments and possibly his fondness for the chamber pot. His final words? Something coarse, something muddled, something lost in translation. His son Charles would follow him and end up with his head in a basket. Charles I believed in divine right like it was a family heirloom, priceless, unquestionable, and far too fragile to actually use. Where his father James had wobbled and waffled, Charles drew lines in the sand and dared Parliament to cross them. They did. So he dissolved it, then brought it back, then dissolved it again. What followed was not so much governance as a 17-year tantrum disguised as monarchy. Eventually, even England lost its patience. Civil war broke out, royalists on one side, parliamentarians on the other. Charles lost battles, lost cities, lost trust, and finally lost the war. He surrendered, played politics with his captors, and imagined he might still win. He didn't. Parliament decided to do something England had never done before, put its king on trial. He refused to recognize the court's authority. The court ignored him. In 1649, Charles I was sentenced to death. On a cold January morning, he stepped onto the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Wearing 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver and seem afraid, he knelt before the axe. One clean stroke, his head held up by the executioner before a stunned crowd. No longer divine, no longer king. But England got tired of regicide fast. His son would return and die of something much less dramatic, possibly in the arms of his mistresses. Charles II. Charles II walked back into England like a man who'd been away for too long and found all his enemies dead. After 11 years of Puritan rule and grey-faced governance under Cromwell, Charles returned in 1660 to public cheers and very little paperwork. He brought theater, fashion, sexual liberty, and the general vibe of a Restoration-era rock star. The court became a playground of excess. He had mistresses, illegitimate children, and more charm than judgment. He also had problems: plague, fire, a suspiciously Catholic brother, political plots, assassination attempts. The tension between Parliament and the Crown never quite went away, just hid under velvet and wit. Charles played the game with a grin and a raised eyebrow. Then his health began to slip. In 1685, after a sudden seizure during a morning routine, Charles lingered in agony for several days. He received last rites, Catholic last rites, to the shock of many. His final words, reportedly, were an apology to the physicians for taking an unconscionable time to die. A fitting end for a king who made death look inconvenient. He died childless, crowned in irony, and his brother James would take the throne next, briefly, before exile, and a brain hemorrhage in a foreign bed. James II. James II never quite figured out how to stop being suspicious. As the openly Catholic brother of a Protestant nation's favorite rake, he took the throne in 1685 under the uneasy gaze of nearly everyone. He promised tolerance, then started packing the army and universities with Catholics. He issued declarations, revoked laws, and gave England the political equivalent of a stress rash. When he had a Catholic son in 1688, Protestant England panicked. Enter William of Orange, his son-in-law, invited by Parliament to come take the throne. James fled, tossing the Great Seal of England into the Thames on the way out, because if he couldn't have the crown, no one could have the stationery. He landed in France, exiled, dethroned, but not dead. He spent the rest of his life brooding in the court of Louis XIV, clinging to the idea of restoration like it was a family pet. He made one more failed attempt to invade Ireland, then returned to waiting. In 1701, he suffered a brain hemorrhage. He died in exile, not with a bang, not with a battle, but with a twitch, a silence, and the ghost of a crown he couldn't let go. His daughter Mary would inherit next, and die young and pocked. William III. William III wasn't English. He wasn't charming. He wasn't even particularly warm-blooded. But he was Protestant, competent, and married to Mary James II's daughter and England's most convenient insurance policy. When Parliament invited him to invade his own father-in-law in 1688, William didn't hesitate. He landed with an army. James fled without much of a fight, and William and Mary were crowned joint monarchs, smiling through what was basically a polite coup. Mary died young. William ruled on alone. His reign was cold, deliberate, militaristic. He spent more time at war with France than enjoying England's famously moody weather. He introduced the Bill of Rights, reshaped Parliament's power, and generally tried to make monarchy more professional, like turning a bar fight into a board meeting. Then came the horse. In 1702, while riding at Hampton Court, William's horse stumbled over a molehill. He was thrown violently, breaking his collarbone. Infection set in. Pneumonia followed. Within days, he was dead, brought down not by armies, but by a small, unseen mound of earth. The Jacobites toasted the little gentleman in black velvet, the Molias, the accidental assassin. After him came Anne, who ruled over Union, Empire, and 17 lost pregnancies. Mary II. Mary II didn't want to be queen, not this way. Not in exile, not at the cost of her father's throne. She wept when James was overthrown, even as she signed the documents confirming it. But she ruled anyway, side by side with William, as part of England's most awkward political marriage. Devout, intelligent, and emotionally fragile, Mary was the heart behind William's hard edges. She had no children, miscarriages piled up like tombstones in a diary. Her health wavered. She poured herself into governance and religion, rebuilding the Church of England with the urgency of someone trying to atone for simply existing. Then came the rash. In 1694, Mary contracted smallpox. At first it seemed mild, then it wasn't. The pustules spread, fever spiked. Her skin blistered, darkened. Visitors weren't allowed. The court whispered prayers. Mary, terrified and lucid, faced her end in full view of the disease that had already scarred her mother. She died at 32, disfigured and devout. William never remarried. And after his own death, the crown passed to Mary's sister, Queen Anne. A woman who lost every child she ever bore and still managed to bury the last remnants of old England behind the Act of Union. Queen Anne bled quietly. Through 17 pregnancies, she bore no surviving child. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died before they could speak. Each one chiseled her down a little more. She ruled in pain, crowned with grief, her body swollen with gout and heartbreak, her court divided between sycophants and saboteurs. She came to the throne in 1702 after the deaths of William and Mary, the Protestant compromise in a country still allergic to Catholic rule. She was stubborn, kind, emotionally brittle, and ruled during a transformative era. The Act of Union in 1707 made her the first sovereign of Great Britain, a new title stapled onto an old body. But Anne was deteriorating. Gout ravaged her joints. She was carried in a sedan chair, bloated and exhausted. Her eyesight faded, her speech slurred, and still she ruled. Clutching letters from lost children, hiding behind fans, her last words a murmur, "My God, protect me." In 1714, she died of a stroke, alone but surrounded by a nation she had reluctantly helped reshape. She left no heir, only a crown that had to leap over 50 Catholic relatives to find a Protestant one. And thus began the House of Hanover where death got more clinical and less poetic. George, I never wanted to be British. He barely spoke the language, loathed the food, and spent more time in Hanover than in London. But thanks to a Protestant bloodline and Parliament's deep-rooted fear of Catholicism, he found himself king in 1714. England got a monarch it couldn't pronounce, and George got a country that rolled its eyes every time he opened his mouth. He ruled with distance both emotional and geographical. Parliament handled most decisions, while George sulked in palaces and plotted revenge on anyone who questioned his authority, which was almost everyone. He locked up his ex-wife, exiled his son, and trusted nobody. His court was divided into pro-George and pro-Prince factions, and his own ministers frequently worked around him rather than through him. In 1727, while traveling back to Hanover possibly just to get away from the damp English air, George suffered a stroke. He died on foreign soil, away from the throne he never really embraced. No deathbed speeches, no royal grandeur, just a sudden, silent collapse in a carriage. England hardly wept, but it did inherit his son, George II, who would die at home but just as suddenly and far more explosively. George II spent most of his reign trying not to be his father and failing at it in new and unpredictable ways. He spoke better English, fought a bit harder, and pretended to care slightly more. He led troops into battle at Dettingen, the last British monarch to do so, then spent most of the rest of his reign letting Parliament do the governing while he criticized it from a safe, well-upholstered distance. He was irritable, sharp-tongued, and paranoid about assassination. He hated his son, Frederick, with such commitment it bordered on sport. When Frederick died before him, George is said to have muttered, "The rascal died before me," and returned to his evening tea, utterly unbothered. His end, however, was unexpected. In 1760, while on the toiletise, again George suffered what was likely an aortic dissection. One moment he was king, the next he was dead on the lavatory floor, blood pooling under velvet slippers. The heart gave out. The country moved on. He left behind a throne for his grandson, a boy who would rule longer, suffer deeper, and descend slowly into darkness. That boy? George III, the king who lost America and eventually his own mind. George III. George III began as a symbol of stability. No mistresses, no scandals, a family man, a sober ruler. He wanted to be a king of principle, of morality, of good governance. For a while he was, but history tends to remember what comes later, and what came later was madness. He lost America first. The colonies rebelled, and his redcoats couldn't hold the line. Parliament quarreled. Revolution echoed across the Atlantic. George became a figure of ridicule. The mad king who lost the colonies. But his real unraveling was just beginning. He suffered from a mysterious illness, what is now believed to be porphyria, though that diagnosis still floats in debate. It twisted his body and shattered his mind. He babbled, screamed, talked for hours without stopping. His skin turned blue. He mistook trees for kings and begged his servants to protect him from imaginary assassins. Eventually, he went blind, then deaf, then silent. He died in 1820, after 60 years on the throne, most of them marked by decline. By the end, he didn't know he was king. He didn't know his wife had died. He didn't know the century had changed. But his son George IV knew, and he would rule next louder, larger, and just as broken inside. George IV. George IV was born wearing silk and lived like velvet could solve his problems. While his father George III spent his final years blind and babbling, George IV was rehearsing for the role of ornamental monarch. He adored fashion, alcohol, women, and flattery especially in that order. By the time he officially became king in 1820, he'd already spent nearly a decade ruling as Prince Regent. The Regency era was glittering, decadent, and utterly hollow, just like the man behind it. He was grotesquely overweight, possibly addicted to laudanum, and buried under more lace than a bridal boutique. His estranged wife, Caroline, was banned from his coronation. His subjects mocked him in street songs. Satirists couldn't keep up. Parliament politely ignored his excesses until they couldn't anymore. By the end of his life, George IV was barely human under the layers of swollen flesh and powdered wigs. He suffered from gout, dropsy, and hardened arteries. He spent hours being carried up and down stairs. Walking exhausted him. Talking winded him. In 1830, his heart gave out. Death came quietly, possibly because it was embarrassed to be in the same room. The next monarch, William IV, had fewer mistresses and slightly more dignity, but still wheezed his way to the grave. William IV. William IV was the spare who never expected to rule. He joined the Navy at 13, spent his youth swearing at sailors and collecting illegitimate children, and seemed content to grow old in mild disgrace. Then Fateor, a series of unlucky royal death, hoisted him onto the throne at age 64. He was called the Sailor King, though most of his sailing had been decades behind him. Still, his bluntness appealed to a public weary of George IV's peacock routine. William was awkward, irritable, and refreshingly unimpressed by ceremony. He walked the streets without guards, ate in public, occasionally shouted at ministers. He presided over the passing of the Reform Act of 1832, a reluctant participant in one of the most significant political shifts in British history. His reign wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. He stabilized a crumbling monarchy just long enough for someone else to reinvent it. That someone was his niece. But before she arrived, William's lungs began to fail. Years of asthma, compounded by heart disease, wore him down. He died in 1837, gasping for air, grateful to go before Parliament pushed another bill at him. And then came Victoria, girl of 18, crowned in a world not ready for her endurance. Victoria wasn't supposed to be immortal, but from the moment she ascended the throne in 1837, she refused to blink. The last Hanoverian monarch and the first true symbol of modern British Empire, she outlasted every minister's, rivals, even decades. She began as a teenage queen and ended as an institution draped in black crepe and colonial gilt. She loved Albert deeply. When he died in 1861, she folded herself into mourning and didn't come back out for 40 years. The queen became a recluse. The widow became an icon. Her black dress became the unofficial uniform of grief. But she ruled stubbornly. She presided over a country that ballooned into an empire through revolutions, wars, and railroads. She made monarchy respectable again, or at least survivable. Her final years were a slow decline. She grew shorter, rounder, increasingly deaf, increasingly immobile. By the end, her eyesight failed. Her memory faltered. Her hands trembled. In the 19th of January 01, she suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and lingered in a fog of confusion before slipping away. She died at 81, wrapped in relics, surrounded by symbols. Her death closed a century. The next king, Edward VII, had waited nearly his entire life for the crown, and it would kill him fast. Edward VII. Edward VII spent most of his life waiting for his mother to die. By the time Queen Victoria finally vacated the throne in 1901, Edward was nearly 60 and already looked exhausted. He had lived in the long, narrow shadow of an empire that preferred morning crepe to laughter, and he had responded accordingly with cigars, mistresses, and scandal. As Prince of Wales, he was everything Victoria disapproved of. As king, he was everything England needed at the turn of the century: sociable, diplomatic, fashionably decadent. The Edwardian era sparkled with polite sin and powdered civility. Edward smoothed diplomatic relations, hosted dazzling royal events, and basically functioned as Europe's uncle. But his lifestyle had a cost. He smoked 20 cigarettes and 12 cigars a day, carried his stomach like a throne, and suffered from chronic bronchitis, heart disease, and sheer excess. He kept going through force of habit and sheer indifference to death. In 1910, after a series of heart attacks, some of which he ignored in favor of card games, Edward VII died. His last words were reportedly, "I am very glad." Whether that was about his reign, his cigars, or simply being allowed to stop pretending to be healthy, no one knows. His son George V would take the throne and die in a far more calculated fashion. George V. George V was the monarch as moral wallpaper, dutiful, dull, and determined not to offend. He came to power during an age sliding out of deference and into war. He looked like a post office clerk who had stumbled into a crown and decided to keep it, but he was steady exactly what Britain needed as it spiraled into World War I. He changed the royal house's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor in 1917 because German-sounding monarchies weren't good PR while Germans were shelling the Western Front. He lived through revolution, war, and social upheaval with quiet conservatism. While his cousin Nicholas II was murdered in a Russian basement, George survived by staying bland and dependable. But his health began to decay in the 30s. Years of smoking left his lungs cracked and failing. In the 19th of January 36, he slipped into a coma. His physician, fearing a prolonged and undignified death, administered a fatal dose of morphine and cocaine. It was a mercy killing disguised as timing, to ensure his death would make the morning papers, not the less dignified evening edition. His son Edward VIII would take the crown next, and then, astonishingly, give it back. Edward VIII. Edward VIII was born for the crown but not the job. Charming, glamorous, and emotionally allergic to responsibility, he ascended the throne in 1936 and promptly detonated it from within. His reign lasted 326 days, just long enough to prove that fairy tales and monarchies do not mix. The problem was Wallis Simpson. Twice divorced, American, not royal. The Church of England forbade him from marrying her as king. Edward chose her anyway. He abdicated with a shrug and a radio speech, saying he couldn't carry on without "the woman I love," as if the monarchy were an inconvenient job offer he'd politely declined. He became Duke of Windsor, a royal ghost. He married Wallis, hosted awkward tea parties in exile, and flirted with fascism just enough to make his wartime image deeply uncomfortable. He never returned to real power. He died in 1972, of laryngeal cancer, his voice gone, his role long since reduced to anecdote. The crown had moved on without him. His brother, George VI, never wanted the throne, but he took it reluctantly and ruled through war, illness, and a growing national exhaustion. His death would come quietly, but not peacefully. George VI. George VI wasn't meant to be king. He was the spare, the shy one, the stammering naval officer with more nerves than ambition. But when his brother Edward VIII abdicated for love or lust or vanity, depending on who you asked, George was shoved onto the throne like a man being drafted into service. He took it, quietly, reluctantly. And then he became something the country didn't expect, steady. He reigned through World War II with a clenched jaw and a trembling voice. Bombs fell, cities burned. He stayed, refused to leave London, refused to flee, walked through rubble like a man who knew the walls might collapse again at any moment. The people loved him for that. He became less of a monarch and more of a symbol of endurance, of calm, of keep going. But the war took its toll. So did the chain smoking. He lit cigarettes like they were punctuation marks. Lung cancer followed, along with arteriosclerosis. He had part of a lung removed. The other followed soon after. On the 6th of February, 1952, George VI died in his sleep of a coronary thrombosis. His body had nothing left to give. The crown passed again, this time to a young woman who would wear it longer than anyone in history. Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II began her reign in a tree house, literally. She was in Kenya, atop a fig tree, when her father died. The next morning she descended the ladder as queen. For the next 70 years, she would never again be anything else. She became a fixture, a symbol, a portrait on currency, and an idea in the minds of millions. She ruled through eras that erased everything but her. Empires dissolved, governments collapsed, prime ministers came and went like seasonal staff. The Beatles rose, Diana died, Brexit happened, and through it all, she waved, spoke carefully, said little, endured everything. The monarchy survived by freezing in her image. She grew older, then ancient. Her voice lowered, her public appearances grew fewer. The wrinkles deepened but never cracked the image. When her husband Philip died in 2021, she sat masked and alone at his funeral, stoic, symbolic, devastating. In 2022, she finally died. The official cause, old age. No drama, no scandal, no grand national trauma, just the slow cessation of a life that had already become history long before it ended. Her reign closed with quiet ceremony. And now, the crown passes again. To Charles, a man who's waited longer than any other, and whose death for now remains unwritten.